Good evening and welcome to Plain Talk Elections Special. The voting for election 2015 is over, and within the hour, the chairman of GCOM will announce the results of 96% of the statements of poll. Of course, a final declaration of the results and the formal part of swearing in of the president will have to take some time yet. As you probably are aware, the PPPC, which on Tuesday had reported that its own count had given it an unassailable lead in the general elections, is now demanding a partial recount in all the regions. Now, just for clarity, the PPPC does have such a right. In fact, there are two levels of recount that are available under the law. The first one is the recount at the place of poll. That has now passed. So it's a question of the announcement or the recount after the announcement by the returning officer in the polling district. That is yet to take place. Now, at a press conference earlier today, top PPPC members, Ms. Priyamanik Chan, Dr. Frank Anthony, and Mr. Anil Nandalal, could offer no justification for the recount call other than that it can impact on seats in the region. There is some suggestion that the call is an act of desperation, since none of the issues they are now raising had been raised before. And in fact, those issues had been accepted by the polling agents when the count was done at the place of poll. The PPPC likes to sing about its democratic credentials, but its delay tactics, it is suggesting that for it, democracy does not include being voted out of government after 23 years. In other words, it would seem for the PPP, democracy means it only has a right to rule Guyana. If the PPPC is truly democratic, if it is interested in the development of the economy and in the well-being of the country, it will revoke its call for a recount and allow GCOM to swear in whoever is the leader of the party with the most votes, and allow the country to get back on its path of development. As a citizen, whilst I recognize the right of the PPPC to demand a recount, I think the grounds are not strong enough, and I would therefore like to call on business leaders, influential individuals, and civil society bodies to impress on the PPPC the need for it to place country before party, public before self, and to revoke its call for recount across the regions, as it has been advised to do by the diplomatic community, all the observer groups, and I understand some members of the private sector. My name is Christopher Ram, and welcome again to Plain Talk. My guest this evening, starting from my immediate right, Mr. Carl Greenidge. To his right is Dr. David Hinds, and to my extreme right, Mr. Nigel Hughes, attorney at law and one of the orators of elections 2015. Gentlemen, welcome to Plain Talk.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Chris.
More than 48 hours after the close of poll, still no formal results. How do you manage supporters' anxiety, whichever party one belongs to?
Well, Chris, if I might set the ball rolling, I think the first requirement is to ensure that the process through which GCOM is required to take us is made plain to the public so they understand at each stage what is taking place. I think that is the first requirement. And in a sense, the difficulty that faces us has to do with GCOM itself, because I'm not myself sure that the press conferences that have been held have done that in as clear and as focused a manner as it should. We are at a very sensitive point in this country's history. Elections at this point are politically sensitive given the background of misuse of state resources and so forth. And therefore, it is imperative that the Commission assures the public that it is doing what is required of it, and that delays that we may be encountering are not the result of any banditry or underhand events or occurrences. There are 2 points I'd like to make just to close. One is that GCOM itself clearly has not been able, I think, to satisfy the public that its own internal processes are as perhaps efficient or as expeditious as they should be. And the second observation is that as regards the process itself, we may have perhaps encumbered the Elections Commission with maybe too many hurdles. Because this is a process, it is absolutely absurd that a country so small, where the counting of the votes has already taken place in situ, as it were, should require so many days to count a few 100,000 votes, and that clearly the public is concerned. You can't erase from their mind that is unacceptable, and that is perhaps a requirement that we will have to address in the future.
Yeah, I want to endorse what Carla said, but I want to draw attention to the question as how do we keep the public
manage supporters.
And I want to say something extraordinary is happening around this election. Is that the people are controlling themselves. I mean, this is really tremendous. The streets are clear. People are not gathering the streets. They're not threatening anything like that. People are staying home, and they've been extremely patient. This is the most patient around election time that I've seen in all my years of observing elections in this country. But I think the moment, I think people have grasped the importance of this moment, and that in their own individual and collective ways have decided that they're not going to become baits. And the PPP certainly is trying to rile people up and trying to get people to get onto the streets and to do these kinds of things.
When you say rile people up, by doing what?
By delaying the process, because I think that's what they're doing. They're delaying the process. All right, and so I think we have to give the people credit. Certainly, the leaders have to be given credit for constantly calling for calm. But I think we have to give credit to the Guyanese people, especially the supporters of the coalition, for disciplining themselves in a really serious way. And so what we've seen in this election is, I think, a really a flowering of a positive political culture, which can only augur well for us for the future going forward.
I could only say I fully endorse what both Carl and David said. I just want to extrapolate a little bit on what David said. This election, I think we have seen a maturity that has not been seen ever before. There were a series of acts that I believe were intended to be provocative. Mr. Crummy Wing's death, various statements being made, where people have remained calm. And one of the incidents that I recall, election day at 3 a.m., people were going through villages ringing bells and knocking on doors saying, "You got to come and
Not
vote."
beating drums.
I'm not doing that, but it's interesting. I was doing a final sweep in All Boys Song on Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock for the last set of people who may not have come out. And every citizen that we went past, whether they were hanging in the street, whether they were in the house, from the time they recognized me, they showed me the finger. And they all said that from 3:30, people were ringing bells and knocking on doors saying, "You got to get out to vote." My secretary who lives in Diamond, at 20 to 6, there were 200 people in the line. And people voted and then went home, or they were very peaceful. I am very impressed. But on the GCOM issue, I don't think I don't particularly want to be particularly harsh, but I don't think the content of what has been said from the first press conference has really done much to address the concerns of the people. At the end of the first press conference, they said they don't know when they're going to hold the second one. We let you know. You can't say to a country, that's what you're going to do. And as a result, we have had, 3 days of no work. One is a holiday, and nothing is going on. If you think of it, by the time the announcement is made, we would have lost 1 out of the 52 productive weeks of the year, which we didn't cater for. So this is not Christmas or Easter. This is 1 productive week gone. And I think GCOM probably needs to manage the way they are addressing these issues.
I don't wish to inject my own views in this segment of the program, but I can find no basis, legal basis, for lots of the functions that GCOM has arrogated onto itself. Many of those functions, it is not for GCOM. And I spoke with a very senior commissioner. He said, well, Chris, this has been the practice. And that's about it. There's no legal basis. So when the chairman speaks about the law and the law, I think he's mistaken. But that's an issue, as you rightly said, we will have to deal with. How significant, Nigel, and so you don't have to say you agree with both of them.
Both of these gentlemen are my seniors not engaged, but in every other aspect of life. So,
how important are elections 2015 in the history of Guyana?
Let me say this. In the history of Guyana, I think, based on the results we have, this is probably the most significant election that we've had. The results that we have, and I say this with great respect to any announcement that would be made, the results that we seem to have in our possession.
And you want to say what that is? So I think the viewers might wonder why are we teasing
because
it?
then something else spirals out
Sure.
of control, and Facebook in the next minute will have, the joint opposition has got. So I don't really want to say that, but this is the first time in the history of Guyana that we have had a clear majority in favor of the largest collection of political views. You've got in the APNU AFC 6 principal parties who said we're talking about moving the country forward. APNU, PNC, WPA, AFC, all the parties in there coming forward.
Across ideological
and it's the first time I believe we have seen a migration away from a pure race vote. I believe we're beginning very tentatively to break that. Migration and other things, of course, have contributed to that, but I think its historic significance should not be lost. I think this is the first time in our history since independence.
Easily the most important election since self-government in the 1950s. Of almost 60 years, more than 60 years since our first election under dual suffrage in 1953. I think this election really tested our maturity as a political entity, as a country, as a polity. I think we have passed with flying colors. What is significant, and I want to add to Nigel's point, what is significant is for the first time we've put before the electorate something that is different from what we've put before them before. What we've put before them before are two political parties, which then was interpreted to mean the major political groups. This time, what we
2011, you had 3.
But 2011, we started the process, and this time, what we put before them is this umbrella under which you have these 6 political parties. And as I said on another program, if you didn't like the AFC, you could vote for the WPA or the PNC. If you didn't like the PNC and you didn't like the AFC, the WPA, you could vote for the Justice for All. And I think that's a real creative process that we have uncovered moving forward, in that we can now put before people a real choice, but a choice that is based on principle. So it's a diverse coalition, and that you can vote for your country in the process. So I think it's a really, really, really significant election. The PPP and may have in the gruesome 23 years may have pushed this country to really discover its true self. We talked about...
And how has it come out?
And as I said, with flying colors, right? And you know, we talked about the discipline of the people around this election, something that we have never seen before. But we've also seen a kind of steely resistance on the part of the people. I went through the villages on election day, and I saw young people, independent of the party organization, in the communities, organizing in the streets and in their blocks and bringing people out to vote. I've never really seen that around election time. So I think what this election really did is really unlock that kind of energy that a vibrant democracy needs. And so for me, easily, it's the most significant election.
Well, Chris, I concur with what has been said, and what I could perhaps contribute further is to say that I think that the most significant factor here has to do with the attitude and the behavior of the electorate as a whole. My own assessment is that people arrived at a point where they decided that in future, or their future depends very much on what would happen on May 11, 2015. And they just made up their mind, come what may, the abuse of state power, bribery on the part of the state by using state resources to suborn institutions and members of the public. In spite of all of that, that they wanted to express a view by way of their vote that was at odds or different from that which the direction in which the government was trying to push them. And it is, in a sense, a reflection of a maturity of the electorate. This electorate, perhaps unlike many in the Caribbean over the years, showed a very, very, well, relative to the others in the Caribbean, has shown a maturity in terms of its embrace of ideological, radical, militant politics. It was early in that regard, this Guyanese electorate. Today, perhaps what faced them wasn't the old ideological choice between left and right, between parties claiming to be more or less progressive, but a choice in relation to what is a relatively complex set of issues before them. It's not the first time that you've had elections, a lot of which have turned upon corruption, for example. It is the first time that the constitutional issue has loomed very large. But in a lot of the debate, there are issues pertaining to finance and the abuse of state power. And it isn't always easy to actually, for the public as a whole, to discern and make choices in the face of those. What a subtlety. Sometimes they become... I noticed that when Canada prorogued its parliament, Prime Minister Harper prorogued his parliament twice, in the political analysis of the changes or of the challenges that faced the electorate, it was being said, well, the electorate would actually have gone with the Prime Minister by and large, but part of the problem that faced them was that they couldn't work out by and large the subtleties between the role of the governor, Governor General, versus the Prime Minister, versus the opposition leader, rights and responsibilities. And here you have in this election of 2015, all of those thrown in, all. In fact, our case is more complicated because you have an arbiter, supposedly, in the parliamentary and between the parliament and the executive, or the legislature and the executive. But in fact, the president is part and parcel of the legislature in the sense that he has a vested interest. Yeah. And people have been able, yes, I'm sure they've been challenged, but I think the analyses, your own contribution in this regard has helped, but the public has been willing to confront and take on board these things. and to make a choice rather than giving up in despair over, because at one stage they were almost writing off the politicians. The issues are so complicated, let's not bother with that. We're not voting. The youngsters to which you make reference being a major factor here. But clearly in the end, the young people have grasped the nettle and decided that they're going to try to comprehend what is before them and make a decision that's clear. That to me is the impression.
Just one point there to work across that. And they also, I think, have demonstrated they're not going to be dragged back into the past. They appreciate what has happened in the past. We have made mistakes, but they're not going to be dragged back to live there.
And Chris, but before you go, I just want to take from what Carla said and to say that we often think it's difficult in ethnically polarized societies like ours for people to vote on issues. Now, people can vote as an ethnic bloc, and we probably did a lot of that still in these elections, but they were voting on issues. Right? The economic issues, which have always proven to be the most complex issues, they were very clear about corruption. They were very clear about issues like the NIS, social security, all those issues that we talk about. They were very clear about these issues. They were voting on the whole issue of a government of national unity, really appealed to them, and so forth. So we can say with confidence here that despite the ethnic problems that we still face, that our people have been able to cut through that and to vote on the issues.
Or rather, perhaps, David, a significant number. Because I looked at some statements of poll, I looked at some summaries. They were still some markedly...
Well, yes, I never did say that. We're not saying that's not the problem, but we're saying that even in that mix, that they were able to say, this is what we are indicting the PPP for. We're indicting them for corruption. We're indicting them for one-party governance. We're indicting them for the raping of the treasury, for what they did to the NIS, and so forth. And so it was very clear that they were voting on issues.
The next question, I'll exclude Nigel, because it concerns his party. Did these elections vindicate, and we must remember what triggered it, the no confidence motion tabled by the AFC. Did these elections vindicate the AFC in its decision to introduce a motion of no confidence?
Well, certainly. I mean, we can't at this stage say it did not. It certainly. The one thing that we have to understand about politics is that sometimes you take a position and you're not certain where it will end up, right? And so the vote of no confidence, I think, was the spark that was needed to really build a movement in this country. And so in that sense, one has to say that the AFC's move was vindicated.
Okay. Well, I would put it differently. I would say that the process, the end of which we find ourselves at now, was one with a longer genesis than the no confidence motion itself. We have been battling with the government for a long period over abuses. For example, the no confidence motion followed immediately upon the laying in Parliament of a so-called statement of excess. All right? But the statement of excess is part of a pattern. In months prior to that, and a year and 3 months prior to that, we had sought to get the assistance of the courts to stop the government doing exactly the same thing. It took resources, notwithstanding the fact that those resources weren't approved by the House, and it spent them. It did it once. It did it a second time. And the decision to lay the no confidence motion could be seen perhaps in a way as late. What it reflects is not so much, it is a criticism, but the point I'm making has to do with the way that the parties themselves have worked. The significance was that it led to the two parties having collaborated, let us say, sporadically earlier, now saying, hey, this is the end. We will work together from now to the end, come what may. Because we had problems in the budget of 2012 where we could have worked together to bring the government down. We could have brought them down at the beginning of 2012, okay? But I think, the way I cast it before, was that the parties, perhaps with different degrees of naivety, thought that they would be able to persuade the PPP to give up its bad ways. And so, you had And if you come up here, you say, well, we listen to see what they say, how do they justify it? And if you comes up another place and you say you'll abstain, in the end, they undertook acts, all of which contributed to breaking the camel's back, as it were, you know. It was part of a process, and the government has paid the price for being so completely irresponsible in its administration of the responsibilities it's been given.
Now, notwithstanding the composition of this entire panel, including the moderator, there are two demographics that I believe played a very significant role in the process as well as the outcome of the elections: youth and women. Nigel, you're probably comfortable speaking of the second one.
Actually, it was the leader of the AP and you. It was the leader of the AP and you who said I like women, huh?
That's not an indictment.
I want to start with a very, very small example, but really is significant. In the last 3 or 4 days, immediately before the election, there was a situation in the Upper Mazaroni district where the government had sent in the Amerindian Affairs Minister and Ms. Pearson from the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs, and they were distributing solar panels, and they were saying all sorts of really base, awful things about the People's National Congress in particular. We received that information. I went up with Ms. LaRose, Jean LaRose, and met another excellent APNU activist, Don Hastings. And just the organizational skills and their advocacy in the Upper Mazaroni, I was privileged to be with them, I was just part of the team, demonstrated control and ability to persuade, and the results have vindicated in every village, bar one, that we went to, every community that we went to, the coalition won. I think in other parts of the country you will find similar examples. The women have been, I don't want to use the word superior, they have certainly been the force that has carried this campaign. I've seen that over and over again, whether it's in the urban areas and whether it's in the rural areas, from the organizational capacity all the way through to the advocacy. It has been there, and I can only say that this no doubt will continue.
David, you came in late during this campaign. That's correct.
Yes.
But are you sufficiently comfortable to deal with this issue?
Oh yes, I want to do a caralia and to say that what we saw.
You can't.
You forbid it.
I beg, I plead.
Okay, on this occasion.
What we saw in this election actually began in 2011, insofar as women and young people are concerned. Right? The 2011 campaigns of both the AFC and the APNU were driven by young people, and particularly young women. All right? And for a moment we thought we may have lost them given the outcome. But I think it's part of the, if I may use the word renaissance, it's part of this thing that is happening, that they actually outdid themselves this election, and they came forward. And the second thing I want to say is that without offending others, I think it was poor women and poor young people who made the difference. It was the working poor, the poor young men and women in the villages who really made a difference. It was really a really moving experience to see poor people who are always the ones who are left behind. Even when there is plenty in the society, they're the ones who are left behind, who really led us. We were led by poor women and men, poor young people in this election, and they've showed us the way. And you know, I just do hope that as political people we grasp this moment, because it doesn't really come often. It doesn't come in quick succession as it came from 2011 to 2015. They say 3 strikes and you're out. We don't wish for the third time when you're out. We want to harness this because, like I said, without those ordinary poor defenseless often people from the villages and the towns and the hinterland who really came forward, we would not be here tonight talking in such glowing terms.
I have something of a different perspective, not a disagreement, but by way of emphasis. One is to just remind you that traditionally in Guyana, women have been the backbone of the political parties. Traditionally, the labor unions have been a force in both the PPP and the PNC in the history. But as on the PNC side, outside of the PPP, as the unions have been weakened, the role of women as foot soldiers, as middle managers and others, has come to the fore in terms of mobilizing. So I don't think that's new on this occasion, but it was important. That's the point I want to make about that part. I think in terms of the issues, most certainly they have tended to be the ones, I'm speaking now to women, that have reacted perhaps in the most outrage to many of the things that have taken place. And indeed, one can see with some justification when you remember some of the grossest and most vulgar acts of the government ministers and comments, Attorney General Nandlal and Ramsaran. So in a sense, I suppose the PPP's frustration was taken out partly in recognition of the fact that this was a potential source of resistance to their activities. As regards the youths, however, I have a different perspective. We had, I think in 2011, in Demerara, a surge in terms of the, in my view, in terms of the electorate and its if you like, its mobilization for the 2011 general elections. But on this particular occasion, I think many of us had almost given up. The problem appeared to be that the youths were arguing, both the tone of the debate, the issues before them didn't seem to concern them, and therefore it was hard to persuade them to vote. In many years, I spoke to a number of them in New Amsterdam, sportsmen and others, and sometimes you almost despaired. You know, you representing their interests. This is, you need to know this affects you, that will affect you. This is not how politics needs to operate, but that's all they've seen. And therefore, they seemed resigned that whatever party would be in power, they would be the same. What seems to have happened, judging from the vote, and now I'm speaking entirely with the benefit of hindsight, I'm not saying I saw this before, from where I sit today, it seems to me that in Demerara in particular in terms of numbers, that you've had a force for change that's been quite dramatic, and the core of that force for change, the tip of the spear as it were, have been the youths, who seem to have turned out in numbers, notwithstanding the impression they gave us in the last few months that this was not their battle.
I just wanted to comment a very interesting point, but would you agree that perhaps in the last month, because I agree that early stages of the campaign, they were noticeable by their absence, but I certainly think in the last 3-4 weeks, there certainly was a surge in youth involvement and youth
in the campaign itself.
In the campaign itself.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not sure it necessarily, I agree with you, we were despairing that they had become resigned. But I would say maybe not even a month, perhaps in the last 3 weeks.
And it happened in 2011. It was not until nomination day that we saw the surge of young people. So perhaps true to youthful exuberance, they
can sprint, so they can leave it till the last minute.
They come out.
Don't underestimate Facebook as well.
The social media is
social
really
media was,
very important. Yes.
And we've developed some campaigners. I mean, independent
some warriors,
and really warriors. That place is a really battleground of political ideas and political militancy that really warm your heart.
I think it would be doing an injustice if we don't recognize Charlene and Najir as an individual.
That truly inspires. Fearlessness. That's what you hear all the time.
Now, when the elections campaign started, one had a statement from former President Jagdeo. He's done with constitutional office. He then entered on the stage and in the fray. Many persons said he is the greatest asset to the opposition and the coalition. What impact did he have on these elections and indeed on his own party?
I would just, it's not facetious, but probably.
And you're not being personal. I know you've had a long relationship.
Close,
Close relationship with Jagdeo.
All the opposition had to do is say, talk, Bharrat, talk. Because every time Mr. Jagdeo spoke, we were guaranteed that we would get a song bite, we would get something he would do that would really help the opposition campaign. And on every occasion, he did not disappoint. He did not disappoint. He has single-handedly decimated the PPP on his own.
But on the other hand, then I agree with with Nigel. But I think on the other hand, he was an asset for the PPP in really speaking to the fears and insecurities of their population. Insofar
Is
as
that an asset?
well, electorally,
Votes,
right?
no.
That he was able to keep votes to them. He may not have brought votes to the party, but he was able to keep votes.
I don't want to jump in.
Yeah.
But,
No, go ahead, Nigel, go on.
But David, surely,
Yeah.
even the PPP acknowledge that voter turnout in their traditional areas has been low. If he was an asset and if he did energize that base, surely you would have seen an increase in the turnout. The turnout in their traditional areas was below the national average. And that means that what I think he did was he spoke and perhaps articulated their basest fears. And I'm not even sure that he did that, but he went there. But I think by the fact of the low turnout, there was a rejection by the PPP's traditional voters. They weren't going to come vote for the opposition for various reasons. We can discuss that separately. But the mere fact that they were not encouraged, they didn't feel that they didn't feel persuaded enough to go out and vote, was in itself an indictment on people's propensity.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing with that.
So I'm just responding to your point. I'm not sure he might have attempted to appeal to it, but I'm not sure that he was successful at it.
Right. Well, I mean, we can debate that, but I think he was a more significant factor in the election that we, the opposition,
Yeah,
are
absolutely.
making out because
I can see that.
I think Jagdeo spoke to two instincts in a section of the population. He spoke to those old fears. But he also was doing something else because Jagdeo's created a kind of new culture, this culture of force and domination among younger sections of the population. And it's not just but it's not just among East Indians, eh? It's also among some of the other section of the population, Africans and so forth. This whole thing about the bad man and so forth, and the bullyism, right? Which I think that we should not make light of because we'll have to contend with it.
But as you said, these elections rejected that.
No, but hold. I don't know that. Let me say this.
Yes,
I agree with David's first position, namely that Jagdeo's intervention, notwithstanding his commitment, undertaking that he wasn't going to be part of it, undoubtedly had an impact towards the end of the election. In my view, I would cast it as essentially bullyism and racism, trying to play on the fears of the Indian constituencies, particularly on the Currentine coast. And my own impression was that initially there was a reaction favorable to the PPP in that regard. The challenge was then to try and work and neutralize that in terms of taking up those issues, rejecting them, and so forth. So work had to be done on those, and work was done on them. I think we will perhaps need the benefit of some ex-post analysis to really be sure as to what exactly happened.
Yeah.
It may be a timing factor,
Yeah.
Immediately you intervene on an issue like that, the first reaction of the people may be what you want. But as time goes by, they perhaps then realize that is an initial reaction that perhaps is not worthy or it is unjustified. So it may have been, if you like, watered down by virtue of either the passage, the flux of time, or by some of the other efforts to reduce those. But I think the importance here is to recognize that Mr. Jagdeo, having served a term and then a second term, was part and parcel of a cabal, let us use those terms, that perhaps the difference between himself and the current president was that he was prepared to go out front, using his own style to sell a case that clearly was not only a Jagdeo case. You know, a colleague of mine started pointing this out to me a long time ago. We have a tendency to look at him and say, yeah, this is all Jagdeo, but you know, it has to be significant. It isn't merely the incompetence or lack of imagination of Donna Ramatar that has led him not to generate any new initiatives, not to start new projects and so forth. It is the fact that in the PPP, a set of men and a couple of women take the decisions that we see that Jagdeo has been leading. He is the spokesman for that group. He is not a one-man army within the PPP or PPPC. He is the spokesman for what, when you're speaking to the question of bullyism, of a set of bullies in there with a common goal. So they didn't need to change and give you new initiatives because they all agreed with it. The core agreed with it, but Mr. Ramatar could not sell it quite as aggressively, quite as persuasively as Jagdeo could. And it is for that reason that Jagdeo and others within that cabal thought it appropriate for him to jump in and carry the fight. At some point, they're trying the old trick of a good cop, bad cop. But at other stages, he just took over the story, embarrassing the incumbent and leading to some of the very people that he was hoping to persuade throwing their hands up in despair, saying, well, what is really going on? You know, who is really the president? In New Amsterdam, in Berbice, you had, within the space of, within the...
I want to move on.
Oh, just, I was going to say five press conferences by Jagdeo to one by the president in the space of a week.
I want to move on, and I think we've got 17 minutes more if I take back the 2 minutes that the program had from me. And to deal with where we move from here, the link to it is this. How does one deal with this bitterness and divisiveness that was generated during the campaign? This almost craving for maybe some retribution.
Well, if you want me to start, as regards the campaign had a number of characteristics that have to be addressed. I don't think it's only one, but let's start with the one you've named, which is very, very important. The public demands and has been demanding, quite rightly as you say, for serious misdemeanors action. I think you have to address those things. First of all, the violence that has been associated with the run-up. I don't think you can deny the public that right on grounds that it perhaps appears to be vindictive. People are being murdered. We have a society that has committed itself to respect for life, and therefore murders and so have to be addressed. That and violence have to be addressed and dealt with condignly. As regards the economic issues, because many of them have to do with financial improprieties and so forth, I think the answer is to take the most serious cases and pursue them within the law to the full extent possible in law. But you're not going to do or pursue the other characteristic that marked the campaign on the PPP side, certainly. That is to personalize everything. So you take a dislike, you've taken a dislike to a person, either maybe because how he or she behaves or is very critical, and you run them down, notwithstanding the fact that perhaps they may not have been the most serious of the misdemeanors. So what I'm saying is that there are some of the offences have to be pursued, come what may, and I think the public has to be satisfied in that regard. On the other non-life issues as such, you pursue them, bearing in mind, given the importance of the different offences, and stay within the law.
David, if you wouldn't mind if I put this question. The rule of law versus revenge, vengeance. How do you draw that line, Nigel?
That's an easy line to draw. Revenge, rule of law is rule of law. Revenge has no.
In terms of what the public might be craving for.
No, I think in a kind of a way, not in a kind of way, the public are calling for rule of law, and why we seem to perceive it as revenge is because the transgressions of the rule of law have been so significant that people see the clamor for adherence to the rule of law as revenge. It's not revenge. I perfectly agree with what Carla said. We have to identify those cases based on the set of principles we have. I would urge that we also identify a set of international forensic experts, auditing experts and other experts, who will bring to bear their international credentials for independence and their skills to this, so it depoliticizes the appearance that it's revenge. I don't think it's revenge. I think people are just so offended by the extent to which the law has been breached as blatantly as it has been, that their call is really for justice. What you're really hearing here is a cry for justice. That's what you're really hearing, a cry for justice and a cry for equal opportunity. And that equal opportunity is born out of the fact that there has been so much injustice and deviation away from the rule of law. So I don't think it's revenge.
I think, if I might add to that, it is also the case in terms of answering the point you make, that to the extent that you apply those rules to your own, to your own executive, then you will be relatively safe. That has to be understood. These are not rules. These are to be only applied to the PPP. They are rules that will ensure that your people don't do the same, and that to the extent that they break the law or abuse their powers in the same way, these laws will be applied to them. That's very important.
David, I'm not sure what your role is going to be. I sometimes think you're non-resident, sometimes I don't think so. But is there a honeymoon period that this new government is going to be allowed?
No.
By the people?
No. And I can speak for myself. I'm not about to allow the government an honeymoon. And I'm a supporter of the government, and I have been too long in the trenches to see that we have given honeymoons to governments and we end up where we end up today. And I would urge this country not to do that, especially the supporters of the government that's coming in, that we ourselves have to be the oversight of our own government that we voted for. And I intend to lend myself to that process. And so no honeymoon at all. All right?
You had it already.
Yes.
I don't like the enthusiasm with which he says that. I myself called on the crowd in New Amsterdam, for example, to apply the rules right from the beginning, otherwise the government will get accustomed to it. He's getting a bit far. The enthusiasm is too aggressive on this.
I don't know. Were you, by that question, were you asking whether the rules would not be applied? I don't think.
No.
What I mean is the honeymoon period doesn't assume.
When are we going to make grand allowance for a learning curve? No, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
When you make an allowance for learning curve, you have a plan, a commitment for 100 days.
Oh, you mean a commitment for 100 days? But that's not necessarily a honeymoon period. I would say that, and it's not that I'm pleading for a honeymoon, but the reality is we don't know when Mr. Greenidge takes office, for example, what he's going to find in the Treasury. And the reality is we may all have great expectations, but if he goes there and finds nothing, we have to manage our expectations, and therefore it may be interpreted as a honeymoon period, but then we have to readjust our expectations. So I really would like to say we need to be flexible in terms of our expectations.
Yes.
The 100 day
in
plan,
terms of where certain resources are required.
No, but the 100-day plan is not an issue. It is what we do in those 100 days is going to be governed by what we find.
What I was really speaking to is that, when the PPP came to power in 1992, we said give them a chance.
Yes.
When Jagdeo became Republic, we said give the little boy a chance. I'm saying, and we can't afford that. But Chris, I want to speak to the issue of a government of national unity, to the question that you raised. And as you know, all of us here are supporters of a government of national unity. But I think the government coming in is faced with the problem that the PPP has really bulldozed this country in such a way, and they're doing it up to today, that it becomes difficult to include them in a power-sharing government when the government is formed next week.
The leaders of the PPP, because they are, I'm sure they are
members
other than
members of the
PPP
executive
who share a different view, but because
I understand that. But I do think that what we need is a period to allow for constitutional reform, which then makes a power sharing, shared governance constitutional. Let's see the PPP's attitude.
I didn't want to interrupt you, forgive me, but therein lies the contradiction. You can't get the constitutional reform without the PPP.
Well, that's what I'm getting at. Let's see their attitude to constitutional reform, because that will determine whether they in fact want to be part of a national government.
Of course, David, that parties in opposition are always the ones calling for constitutional reform. The PPP did the same thing, and when they got into power, they said they found no great difficulty with the constitution.
I understand, but we made a commitment to the electorate on a government of national unity, and that's what I'm speaking to. It's really a difficulty. I see a difficulty in asking even good people in the PPP to come join a power-sharing government next week. I don't think that is going to be possible in the atmosphere, in this atmosphere. So what I'm saying is that we should remain committed to a government of national unity. But I think we need not a honeymoon, but a cooling out period, all right? To put some distance between this PPP that has bulldozed this country and a PPP that is included in a national government. That's my firm position. Remain committed to ultimately a government of national unity, but we need some space between the PPP and the new government that's coming in.
A quick response to that before I pose the next question.
I probably have a slightly different position to David.
Sure.
I think we need to engage the PPP. We can't cherry pick out of the PPP because I see there's a new leadership emerging, and we have to start discussions immediately with them about how we restructure governance in Ghana, which includes the constitution. I think you have to start that discussion. Of course, that discussion will take time, but I would engage them immediately on
one-to-one or within a broader framework.
No, it's their institution. I would
within the Constitutional Reform Commission, for example. That's I
would engage them in a bilateral meaning joint opposition to the PPP. I wouldn't leave it until you got to the Constitutional Reform Commission. I think the fact is that they represent a significant part of the electorate. We understand that they may not necessarily have had the best leaders, but they were their leaders, and we have to start that conversation. That's just my position.
Maybe one has to draw a distinction here, Chris, between a dialogue with the PPP, and most certainly it is going to be a challenge. You do need the PPP support for constitutional change, and I hope the electorate remembers that. We cannot have committed ourselves to electoral change unilaterally. It has to be with the PPP because you need the votes. But a dialogue can take place with the PPP over changes in the constitution, and that could take place with any PPP leadership. But in terms of inclusion in an executive, for example, I think what was clear from the discussions leading to the Commonsburg Accord is that we could not find a consensus that would allow us to take leaders, existing leaders who would have been tainted by the power abuse and include them in a new administration. So you may speak to whoever the PPP has as representative.
I wasn't saying
right. No, I just wanted to clarify that. But in terms of bringing persons in, there has to be, to some extent, some degree of cherry picking. In other words, you have a filter that says those who have been associated or who the Integrity Commission or who the police have an interest in, we have no interest in terms of being on.
But that's not cherry picking, that's setting up criteria. And therefore you're making sure that you have certain criteria
Right.
So that
that's
you
the
don't
system.
contaminate and manage.
No, it's just your principal position.
Yes,
You can't-
yes.
it's-
Now, the operator signaling that he is taking back his time. Delivering it on promises and capacity. Now, we all know that this government, that they, over the several years, relied on party faithfuls, family and friends, and really stocked up their entire machinery. How do you deliver on your promises within that kind of framework? Assuming you find some money there when you move into it.
I think you have to set out deliberately to ensure that you have criteria that exclude the operation of nepotism, for example. You have to choose people. I mean, a lot of our people, and to me, a lot of the battle of the 1960s, the mid and early 1960s, was over the whole issue of nepotism and the need to have for people to be able to be promoted and selected on the basis of capacity and performance rather than on alliance with a political party or ethnicity even. So these are important issues. We have to respect
But
them.
we know what exists. I mean, how do
you
you
have
get
to-
your promises within this structure?
Chris, I think we have to re-empower the people's organization, re-empower the trade unions, for example. We quickly have to have local government elections and re-empower people in their communities. Because I think governments do what governments do. It's not easy to govern and to deliver on promises tomorrow. But I think if we have the society energized and organized and make demands on government, then we ensure that government moves in a more expeditious way and in a more just way towards dealing with its promises. Promises are made, and promises have to be made when you're on the campaign trail. But it is the society itself that has to hold the government responsible for delivering on those promises. And so we have to, I don't like to use the term civil society. I prefer to use the term people's organizations. It is the people's organizations, the workers' organization, the youth organization, the women organization, the churches, and so forth. And of course, people in the local communities through local government that must make demands to make sure that the promises are
Nigel,
met.
you have the last word.
Local government is a must. I think that will relieve a lot of the that will go a far way towards our ability to deliver. You've got to remember you have 6 parties here, and I think it's going to be far more difficult for any one of those parties to assert their influence to the extent that they want to become nepotistic. I think the beauty of this arrangement we have between these 6 parties, not only is the talent that has been brought to the fore, which I think the PPP suffered in terms of paucity, but I don't see the WPA particularly sitting down quietly and allowing anybody to slip away with nepotism. Their whole political history and culture has been adverse to that. So I think the beauty of it, of the arrangement that we have now between these 6 parties, is that is not likely to slip in. But we do have to be committed.
Your diaspora is also a source
Oh,
of
yes,
capacity
key, very
that you're
important,
asking
key,
about.
very
Diaspora.
important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mr. Nigel Hughes, Dr. David Hinds, Mr. Carl Greenidge, thank you very much for appearing on this Plain Talk election special. I think I will continue the program over the next few weeks whilst I make a firm decision on it. I'd like to thank the operators, and especially I should thank the studio audience, Ms. E. Blackman, Mrs. Zena Ram, and Kristen Ram, who happen to be my family, not nepotism, please, for sitting in on this program tonight. So thank you again. Good night. See you next week.